Recording in progress. All right, so before we get into doing the Photoshop demo with seamless texture, let's talk a little bit about what the requirements are for project 7. So let me get everything kind of situated here. All right, so for project 7, your reference process does not change. If you like your reference, keep it. If not, find new reference. But you're still using your reference to determine whether you need textures and what kind of textures you need. Do you need maps for color? Do you need maps for roughness? Do you need maps for reflectivity? Do you need bump maps or height maps? So those are the basic maps that we're going to be using. We're going to talk about opacity or cutout pattern maps on Monday when we talk about taking the wine label geometry and removing unwanted portions of the geometry at render time so we get the shape of our wine label and it looks like the label's glued onto the bottle and not just a big giant cylinder. All right, so you're going to choose either your interior day or night, your exterior day or night, whichever one you want to do. You're only doing one, but you will be responsible for 2 renders. Remember, you're still going to have the long shot and you're still going to have a close-up. So if you have any, concerns about what that should look like, well, down here at the bottom, we've got some student examples. You can use our Zen Garden photo as reference if you want to do the Zen Garden, day or night. Those objects are real. You can also, anybody who's here on campus can run around out back if you have the time behind building 4D, and you can take your own reference images also for the objects and the geometry that's out there. So the last time I looked, which was a couple of months ago, everything was still there. All right, so as far as what we're working on, today we're going to be working on basic maps. We're going to be working with Photoshop, creating a seamless texture. Lecture 9 with Tony Bagsby. He'll be taking you through the substance process, taking it out of substance back into Maya. And your requirements are you must have at least 1 wood grain object and 1 metal object that you made textures or substance maps for in Substance Painter for the close-up render. Right, so for lecture 10, we're going to be doing 1 projection that you need to do in Maya. So if you've done your projection in Substance, say, for example, you took the AAA logo or a logo and put it on a thermos container in the interior, you still need to do a projection in Maya in your scene in the close-up, which means if you choose not to do it on the bottle, you can do it on the desk, you can do it on the wall. For the exterior, you've got the table. We've got an SAL logo. It's basically a script font that I made a map out of, and you can project that onto the table. You can do it on the cutting board, as long as it's done in Maya. And in 11, we're going to be wrapping stuff up. I'm going to show you displacement maps. They're not required, but if you want to use them, there's still plenty of time for you to be able to do that. Considering at this point, lecture 11, you're really going to be wrapping stuff up. But if you want to add that little bit of extra punch to something, you've decided to use the brick wall or that brick pattern, you can use it as an accent wall in the interior. Those 2 windows at the front of the living room, they are part of an accent wall, which really is a separate piece of geometry from the rest of the house. So that's possible. You can also use it as the ground or the concrete base part for the Zen Garden. the platform there. All right, so just kind of an overview of what we're going to be doing. And if you have any questions about what is required, please feel free to ask. All right, any questions so far? Anybody? Pretty good? Okay. Miles is good. Jesus, any questions? Patrick, any questions? Diamond?
I'm good. I'm just going to watch a replay video of this few 10 minutes I missed.
Okay.
Apologize.
Okay, no problem. Thank you. All right, so let's go into the PowerPoint slide for lecture 8. So let me kind of minimize that. Oh, don't tell me I got rid of it. No, I did. Okay. My window here. All right, so the only difference between my PowerPoint and yours is I've kind of turned off the images at the end. Give you kind of a brief overview of what this looks like. All right, so we have 3 textures that we provide for you, or 3 patterns, if you will, in the Photoshop files. So we've got this kind of reptile skin hide. We've got the brick wall, and we've also got a wood grain texture. So when you throw these objects into an environment, kind of a simplified version of our interior, right? You can see we have noticeable seams, repeatable patterns. After you take them into Photoshop, work on them, get rid of that repeatable pattern, then you should have something that looks a lot less noticeable. You know, if you look really closely, you might be able to see some repeating, but the idea is you want to minimize it so your eye is not drawn immediately to the seams. So that's really the whole process. All right, so primary objective, you know, appropriate reference. This is reference for textures. Same reference, I guess, concepts that you used when just looking for regular reference. You don't want white backgrounds. Anything you're going to try to use as texture reference, you want to make sure that it doesn't have reflectivity built in or baked in to the texture. And you want to make sure that it doesn't have shadows or any light highlights. For example, you know, you're doing something for a bakery, they want to do a virtual, you know, 360 of their bakery with objects you can click on. You know, you don't want to have highlights from somebody's flash on their camera in there, because that's going to basically fix where the light source is. You want the light reflection to be from your environment, not baked in. Same thing with shadows. So for example, gradient pattern looks pretty cool, but we don't need a gradient to describe brushed metal. We can make an anisotropic material that will give us that look. So there's no point in trying to fake something like that. Now, what we would use is that kind of stretched, scratchy looking pattern to get that brushed metal effect, if we were doing a close enough shot where we'd be able to see all the anisotropic brush strokes. All right, so the first part of this document is the brick wall. We're going to go through the brick wall process, and then we're going to take the file that we arrived with at the end, the diffuse file, the color map. We're going to also use that to generate the bump map. I'm going to show you, we're going to sit down and figure out what do we need out of that file. What don't we need? And we're going to do it all in Photoshop because Photoshop, we can keep layers. And that's really the power of Photoshop. You can get back, turn off layers, turn on layers, get back pretty much to any point in that process that you want. You can have layers that will, give you your diffuse. You'll have additional layers that will give you your bump. Turn off the bump layers, go back, work on the diffuse. So it's very flexible. I've also got a section for you guys that I don't have hidden on your doc. It's basically the workflow for doing the wood. Wood's a little bit different. The alligator skin is a little different. Still, they are, each level gets a little harder. Brick walls, probably one of the easier patterns to make repeatable because it's mostly straight lines, right angles. And it's really just getting rid of the seams, getting rid of the color variations in the brick so we can make it appear less like it's the same pattern. So your document won't have these all hidden. Mine does, just to kind of keep it focused. All right, so Photoshop. You guys probably already know a great deal about Photoshop, but I'll just give you a really quick tour just to kind of make sure we all have the same verbiage. All right, so Photoshop, we provide you with what's called a clone stamp practice. If you've never used a clone stamp before, it's a good file to utilize and practice clone stamping. Clone stamping is one of the base tools that we use for removing seams. We also use that, and we use the healing brush. There's a slight difference between the two, but they work together. All right, so I'm going to open up that clone stamp. Got my files downloaded already. Photoshop files, clone stamp, there we go. And I think I might turn off my talking head. Photoshop's running really sluggishly. I find for me, I can't have Photoshop and Maya running at the same time when I'm trying to stream and record. It just slows my computer down way too much. So I got to quit out of one, open the other. Same thing with Unreal and Maya. I can't have them both running at the same time. All right, so let me try and get this inside here. There we go. A little better. All right, so Photoshop tools are on the left side. You click on a tool, it will display the options for the tool across the top underneath the main menus. Think of the tool options in Photoshop as kind of like the attribute editor in Maya. It gives you all the adjustable parameters of that tool. So for example, right now I've got the paintbrush. And you can see I can choose if I have any preset or predefined options for that. I don't. There's my size, there's my hardness, there's the type of brush. Normal, this is generally the mode you're working with. You want to keep your brushes in normal unless you're doing a special effect. Opacity, flow, smoothing. Okay, opacity and flow, generally for clone stamping, you want to keep it at 100%. We don't want fuzzy edges to pixels. We want to have a nice clear covering of pixels that we don't want with pixels we do want. And we want to try and make it as seamless or unnoticeable as possible. We're not trying to feather weights, which is what you would do with flow and opacity. All right, so the thing about Photoshop is if you have more than one layer, so for example, let me just make a couple of layers here. If you have more than one layer, you cannot apply a filter in Photoshop to more than one layer. So for example, if I select a layer, doesn't matter, even if it's this one that's locked, I can go to filters and all my filters are available. If I select multiple layers, so let's select this one plus that. Now everything is turned off. Photoshop does not like multiple layers. Now, for us, that works out pretty well because I always preach what's called non-destructible workflow. In Photoshop, I do not like to alter the original base background layer or whatever that base layer happens to be, unless I've got a copy of it somewhere. But even then, I like to leave it unaltered because at any point in my Photoshop process, I want to be able to turn off layers and go back to the original and redo something or start over if I want to. So a lot of times in order to do that, you combine layers that'll make it into another. Well, it'll take the two layers, merge them together into one. That will let you assign a filter. If you group them together, come on, group. Oh, because it's locked. Okay, that's why. Group. There we go. So even with the grouped layer, it knows, there's multiple layers inside that group. If I select one of them, yep, I got my filters. So the whole idea is we use what are called layer adjustments instead of altering original pixels. So adjustment layers allow us to apply filter-like options, and there's quite a few. Let me see if I can pull this up a little bit more. Oh, come on, Photoshop. Work with me. All right, you know what? Let's just. Here we go. All right, so adjustment layers. You got a whole bunch of different things you can do that you can do in the main menus, but if you do them in the main menus, they will alter the original pixels in Photoshop. And the goal is to not do that. All right, so the clone stamp tool, which is pretty much our premier tool that we're going to be using, looks like a bureaucrat's rubber stamper. Okay, if you hover above it, a lot of the new Photoshop interface will give you a little movie preview of what's going on. So I'm going to select the clone stamp tool, and there are a few settings in the clone stamp you're going to want to adjust. First off, under sample, which is right at the very top, the default is current layer, which means it will allow you to sample the layer you're on and stamp on the layer that you are on. That's all fine and well, but if we're doing non-destructive, we like to clone or stamp onto a blank layer. That way, if we make a mistake, we can easily erase it and not alter the original pixels. So we use current and below. That was specifically designed for multi-layer usage, which means it will let me be on a blank layer. So for example, I make a new layer. I'll call that my clone layer. After I throw my pen around a little. And nice thing about Photoshop, you can have spaces. You can have special characters. Photoshop doesn't really care. So clone layer, now what it will allow me to do is be on that layer. It'll let me sample the layer below it, but stamp onto the clone. Now, the clone stamp tool utilizes some of the same features that Maya's brushes do. You guys know you can adjust your brush size in Maya. What's the shortcut for that? Yeah, brackets, left to right brackets. So if I go right, it makes my brush or clone stamp bigger or smaller. Now in Photoshop, if you want to zoom in and out pretty quickly, you can do Command if you're on a Mac, Command plus and minus. If you're on a PC, it's Control. So you can zoom into pixel level. You can also zoom out so that your image looks like a pixel. Now, when you're zoomed in, if you want to move around, you can use the sliders in the interface or hold the space bar down. That gives you the hand tool, and that will allow you to pan around in Photoshop, which is actually a really nice feature. So for example, if I want to cover up one of these pieces of filth here, what I'm going to do is resize my clone stamp so it's roughly bigger than the area I want to cover, but not too big. The idea is you don't want to take more pixels than you need to cover the area you want to clone, because that tends to make it noticeable. You also want to make sure that you are copying or cloning from an area that has similar value, pattern, and color. So for example, I could probably sample down here. I might be able to sample over here. This was taken with a flash, so you notice you have that vignette effect where it gets darker towards the edges. So going too close to the middle is going to change the color of your color and value of your area. Now, in the clone stamp tool, if you hold the Option key down, that kind of puts it in a little crosshair. That gives you, right now, you are in copy or clone mode. So for example, if I clone this area on top of that brass cover, bring it over here, I get a little preview of that brass cover in my brush or the clone. So now when I stamp on top of it, I've covered up that completely. Now, the nice thing about having layers is if I don't like that, I can turn that layer off. I can delete the layer. I can erase what I did on that layer. So you have total control just by having an additional layer. So I'm going to Z back because I don't want that. What I do want to do is hold Option down. Oh, and I turned off my layer. Notice if you accidentally turn the layer visibility off, you cannot stamp anymore. You can't basically do anything. So you need that layer visible. So now I want to clone from an area that's kind of around this area. So I covered it up. A little bit noticeable. But what I could do is Z back again. I could go and just keep undoing until I, get back to the original state. And don't forget, in Photoshop, you've also got this little history icon here, which if it's not visible, just make sure your history is turned on. And this will allow me to go back in time non-linearly, which unlike Maya, where you have to Z back through the different steps, in Photoshop, you get a list and you can just jump to any point that you want to. So I played around with layer visibility. Let me go back to my clone layer. There, I went back to name change, and now I can just resample my area and stamp without that brass cover on there. So now that's a lot less noticeable than the other one. So again, the workflow for the clone stamp: create a blank layer. Make sure you set your brushes up. You want to make sure your brush has hardness of 100%. You don't want fuzzy edges. The size you can change with the brackets. You want the mode to be normal, opacity, flow to be 100%. Change the sample so it's current and below, which means you can sample below your current layer. So I can just go in and I want to cover that up. Just do that. No, let's go up here. There we go. So now we covered all that up. A big area, I always like to do it in several stages. I don't like to make a big giant stamp of another area. Why? Because the more pixels, the more pieces of that carpet you pick up, the more noticeable it's going to be to the eye. So I'm probably going to keep it this size for now and just kind of sample it here. Maybe come over here just to pick up some different. Just to make it look random. I don't like that. I can go back and fix it. Okay, that one looks like I picked it up from that area. Not crazy about that. So let's see if we can do this. Yeah, it looks a little more random. I can even fix little pulls in the carpet here. Sample this area, come in and just put that right on top. So it's a good way to get rid of blemishes. You want to practice? It's always good practice to do this. Take some family photos that were done with an old school, piece of film. Maybe they got cracks in them. Maybe they're bent. Scan them in, clean them up, and become the family hero. All right, so clone stamp, we are covering up the pixels entirely. We're not trying to blend anything together. Now, the healing brush looks like a little Band-Aid. So if I click on it, anytime you see a little arrow in the corner of your Photoshop tool, that means there are tools that are similar to it in the list. So healing brush, it's in with the spot healing, the patch, the content aware, the red eye tool. Healing brush works exactly like the clone stamp tool with one exception. Instead of it covering up the pixels completely, what it will do is it will take the pattern that you want to stamp onto, but it will take the destination and the pattern color and blend them together. Okay, it sounds a little weird, but for the healing brush, you want to make sure you have the same sample state set, current and below. Again, your brush is going to be completely different. So make sure your brush hardness is 100%. You can change the size of your brush just like you can with the clone stamp, its brackets. All right, so with the healing brush now, if I hold Option down, I'm going to clone here. And what I want to do is put it on top of this electrical access cover. But with the healing brush, I wanted to pick up some of that brassy color and make it look like it was pulled up off of the carpet and it left some residue on it. So now when I clone it, notice that it replaces the pixels, but it also tries to blend into the destination. So it's taking a little bit of that brassiness and putting it onto my carpet stamp. Let's do the same thing over here. So it's really good for blending in two different patterns. And it will not necessarily blend the pattern because it knows the pattern you want to keep, but it will blend the colors together. So for the brick, we're going to have color variations because not every brick is exactly the same color. What we're going to wind up doing is kind of averaging that color together so it looks a lot more natural. So those are the basics of the clone stamp. So Miles, sorry I missed your question there. How did I create the clone layer? Well, down here in Photoshop on the right, there are all the tools underneath the layer. There's a trash can that will delete a layer. You add a new layer with the plus sign. You can group layers together. Here's your adjustment layer, masks, and then special layer styles. So you can add as many layers as you want. Just whatever layer you're on, that's where you're going to clone. So you got to be careful if you're doing multiple layers. Does that answer your question? All right, so in order for me to go into clone mode, you have to hold the Option key down in either the clone stamp tool or the healing brush. It's the same process. So this means you're basically sampling. You hold Option, keep it held down. When you're done, after you click to sample, like here, I click, I release it, I come over here, and now I stamp. All right, so Option, click on the area you want to copy, release the Option key, go to the area you want to stamp onto, click again. Each time you clone, you should clone from a different area. So you get used to Option, click, stamp, Option, click, stamp. Now, to delete extra layers in Photoshop, just hit delete. No, Siri, go away. So the layer itself isn't special. It's the tool with the current and below settings. That is correct. We haven't done anything to the layer. We haven't made any adjustments to that layer. It's the clone stamp tool and the healing brush both have that same up here, sample, current, and below. That's the default is current layer only. So it's kind of frustrating to people who aren't sure about that. It will only let them copy and stamp on the exact same layer, which means people who are new to clone stamping, they will generally get frustrated and just overwrite the pixels because basically you're destroying the original pixels. Whereas here, I just turn everything off and it's all back. And that's what my clone stamps look like, separate by themselves. And it's the miracle of layering. So if I throw this layer underneath, let me turn that off. So if I throw that layer underneath, you can't see them. All right, good questions. Any others before we get started? Questions? All right, Diamond's good. Jesus is good. All right. Thank you. So I'm not going to save my clone stamp. Now, if I were going to save it, I would save it as a PSD. PSD file means I will keep the layers and it will also stop compressing the file. The original file I opened was a JPEG, which means if I open it, make changes, save it, when I open it, I uncompress it. When I make changes and save it, it recompresses it. With a JPEG file, if you open and close it 10 times, you degrade the file 50%. So if you're working in PNGs, JPEGs, TIFFs, even Targas, I always recommend open them up, save them as a PSD, you stop file compression. Work on them, do whatever you want to do. Then when you're ready to export them, then you put them out in your format of choice. You know, hopefully not JPEG, but some other format that's lossless or as lossless as possible for your project. All right, so I'm not going to save. Let's go take a look at what we got here. So we just got done working with the clone stamp. Oh yeah, and when you're making your textures tileable, you have to decide, can I get away with it in one direction, in either U or V, or do I need it in both? Now, if you're working for somebody and you're doing texturing for them, make sure you get it in writing what they want. If they're ambiguous and don't tell you which direction they need to repeat, assume it's got to be both directions. That's usually the safest. All right, so here is our source image. We already looked at what this, or I should say, we already saw what happens when I took this into Maya and tried to make it repeatable, right? I've got the watermark, I've got the top and the bottom. They don't line up, left and right don't line up. So one of the key things about making something repeatable is to make it square. That means the same number of pixels wide as tall. This image is not square, but we can use Photoshop's crop tool to keep it in a square aspect ratio. So I'm just going to kind of talk through this real quick and then show you how it works. All right, so first thing you want to do, get it square. So this is a brick wall. It's got bricks and it's got mortar between the bricks. So to make it seamless, we need to make sure that we get a full course of bricks at the top and the bottom. We also want to make sure that when we go to crop it, we crop it roughly halfway between bricks. You want to get some of the grout from above and you want to have some of the grout from below. So when the top lines up with the bottom, everything fills in like it normally would. And you try to find a left or a right edge that will give you at least a reference point. So here you can see I've got a brick that I found, one of those smaller bricks, because this alternates big brick, big brick, little brick. So I found an area where I can kind of line up a couple of bricks as my left edge. And I'm outside of the watermark. So once we do the cropping, we're going to utilize one of Photoshop's tools called the offset tool. The offset tool behaves a little bit like Maya's repeat UV in the Place 2D. It will allow you to shift the image a number of pixels horizontally and vertically. And what we do is, after we crop it, our image will be a new resolution. So for example, if it was 1024 before, it's going to be maybe 512, 729. It'll be some other aspect ratio or some other, I should say not aspect ratio. It will be some other resolution. And since we're keeping it square, it'll be like, 784 by 784. And when we offset it, we want to offset it half of 784. Half of whatever your new resolution is, because you want to put the seam dead center. And that means we can clone it out easily. And once we clone it out, we don't have to offset it again. Because we've already cropped it on the edges and it's coming in the middle where it belongs. All right, so here's an example of what it looks like after I've cropped it and I've offset it. I can see I've got a few seams to clean up here, but my seam going down the middle is not too bad. The one going down, well, that's a vertical one. There's a horizontal one that's kind of hidden in there, which is pretty, almost invisible, which is good. All right, so once we do the crop and the offset, we create a new blank layer and basically clone out all of those issues. After that, we take all our working layers, we copy them and merge them together, because that copied layer will become a new layer that we're going to apply what's called an adjustment to. And basically what we're going to do is apply a filter to that layer, that copy of all our combined work. And we're going to basically sharpen the image just a little bit. Now, there's tons of sharpen tools in Photoshop. There's sharpen, sharpen more, sharpen edges, smart sharpen, unsharp mask. There's motion, I think there's sharpen, motion. There's a whole bunch of different sharpening features. But all we want to do is sharpen the very brightest parts of the scene, not scene, but the texture, and the very darkest. So bright, dark, we want to allow all the midtones to go through. And basically that is using what's called a high pass filter. The highs and the lows pass through, changed, but the midtones don't. They just remain the same. So that will give us the ability to give us just a little crisper look to the image. Because whenever you get images off the internet, they are processed, they've been compressed, they lose a little of their clarity sometimes. So it's always a good idea to tweak them up just a little in Photoshop. Whether you do it with the high pass filter or one of the sharpen tools, totally up to you. So a couple examples of before and after. Once we're done with that, that is basically, we apply basically a blend mode to allow the high pass to allow everything through so it looks normal. Because before you do that, you wind up with this gray. All right, once we do that, that's basically your color map. And then from the color map, we're going to extract the bump map. So the first thing we have to figure out for a bump map is, do we need color information? No, the answer is no, right? Because remember, we're only using a bump, black and white, 0, 1, or some level of gray. So having color information is unnecessary for the bump map. So we make an adjustment layer, and Photoshop has an adjustment layer that allows us to change everything to black and white without changing the original image. Basically, black and white converts all the reds, the greens, the blues to the proper shades of gray. We got black and white. But now we look at this image and we go, okay, is this going to give me what I want in a bump map? In a bump map, black looks like it goes in, white looks like it comes up off the surface. So we figure out, well, the grout's going to look like it's coming out. It's going to look like an ice cream sandwich. It's melted. When you take a bite, all the ice cream is going to ooze out. We don't want that. We want the grout to be recessed a little bit, and we want the bricks to be out a little bit. So we actually need to use another adjustment layer to invert it. And then I want to get a little more contrast between the dark part where the grout is and the brick. Right now, everything is super gray. I want to get the bricks to be a little brighter so they push out just a little bit, and the grout to be a little darker. So we use what's called an adjustment layer, and I happen to like levels. The reason I like levels is because I get a histogram or a picture of what the image looks like just based on highs and lows and blacks and whites. So you'll notice that for this histogram, we get an area here. Those are my highlights. This area right here, that's my midtones. And over here, those are my shadows. So you can see there's a huge spike in the middle where the midtones are, because that image is mostly gray. In fact, photos in general have a lot of gray information, a lot of midtone information. And usually we like to pull that just so we get a little more contrast. So even with the best cameras, a lot of times we'll go into Photoshop and we'll tweak the images so we get a little more definition between shadowy areas, especially if you've got a face. You don't want the nose to look like it's bleeding into the cheek. You want to be able to see that it's a different tone, but not have it bleed in. So we can adjust it so that we get a little more definition. And then this would eventually become our bump map, where the bricks are not quite pure white. They are very, very light gray. They've got some imperfections in them, which personally I like because, you know, not all bricks are flat. Some have indentations, some have scratches, some have bumps on them. Depends on how the bricks were made, the curing process, the quality. All right, so that's the workflow. Let's open up that brick wall and take a crack at it. All right, so first thing I'm going to do when I open up something I want to work on, I'm going to save as PSD. This will be my working copy. So first thing I'm going to do, change the format, source, call that 2021-05. Now I can add as many layers as I want. I can do whatever I want in Photoshop. It's stopping the compression, and it is also keeping my layers. So first job, activate the crop tool. And then under the crop tool options at the top, I want to choose 1-to-1 square. That's going to force the area to be square, no matter how I push and pull that crop tool. It's going to remain square. Now, part of the problem is, like, if I line it up at the top, I line it up at the bottom, you know, you may have to move the image inside the crop a little bit. Like, what I want to do is, let me reset this. Let me cancel it. There we go. All right, so I'm going to go back, choose 1-to-1. And out of the box, if I try and crop it in the middle here, try and crop it in the bottom, I still have part of that watermark in my crop area down here at the bottom. So this is where I want to kind of move my image over a little bit. And I'm going to actually zoom in because I want to see exactly where I'm cropping. All right, so it looks pretty good at the top. The bottom doesn't look too bad. I found an edge here. So let me just pull that over. Trying to get roughly in the middle here. So, you know, this left side lines up with the right side. Got a little piece of the brick here. It's going to be picked up with that. And basically what I'm trying to do is keep as much of the pattern as possible, because the more of the original you can keep, when you repeat it, the less noticeable it will be, because you'll have more information. So I'm just trying to line it up so I get roughly halfway between the grout at the top and the bottom, get that watermark out of my crop area, find a left edge or a right edge, it doesn't matter. And now I'm willing to see, will this work for what I want it to do? So to activate the crop tool, I can click the checkbox up top. I can also hit return or enter. Now it's cropped. Now, before I commit and I save this in Photoshop, I want to see what this looks like offset. Now, in order for me to offset it, I need to know what my resolution is. Well, down here at the bottom, right here, Photoshop is showing me what my resolution is. It's showing me that my new resolution is 786 by 786 pixels. Now, yours might be off. Yours might be 785, 784, 788, 789. Okay, if you have an odd number, just go to the next even number and cut it in half. Why? Because you can't really work on half a pixel. I mean, eventually that half a pixel may look like you're doing something in Photoshop, but that's still taking up 1 pixel space in your image. So 786, if you're like me and you can't really do the math in your head super quick, I will go, okay, 786 divided by 2. That is my offset. So whatever your pixel number is, cut it in half. That's going to be my offset. So the offset tool, with your original layer selected, you go to Filter, Other, Offset, down at the bottom. In Photoshop, anytime you have 3 dots or an ellipse after a name, you get a menu, or you get user input. So usually, the default in Photoshop is going to be 0. So the settings in Photoshop, make sure you have preview turned on. Make sure it's set to wrap around. That's my original image. I want to offset horizontal and vertical 398, or sorry, 393. So you can see it shifted it over horizontally. And now let's go vertically. Now notice I don't even have to hit enter. That's the beauty of it. With preview turned on, I can look at it and go, actually, that's not bad. I got a little bit of a seam up top to fix. I got some color variation in the middle, but not bad. If I don't like it, I can hit cancel, Z back to before I cropped it, recrop it again, and try. If you take the time to crop your image right the first time, it saves you a lot of clone work or fix up, clean up work at the end. So this one turned out pretty good. I click OK. I'm going to get out of that crop tool. That makes me nervous. And I'm going to save my working copy. So now let's inspect the damage here. So I got to clone in this piece of brick. I got some color variations here, which is really not too bad. Right here is noticeable up there. Okay, my seam running down the middle's not bad. I can see a little bit of, some variation in there, but that's actually quite minimal. So I'm happy with it. I'm going to create a new layer. That's going to be my clone. And again, you click that little plus sign down next to the trash can at the bottom of the layers. Like I said, Photoshop is very forgiving with naming. It doesn't care. You can have spaces. You can have special characters. You can do whatever you want in Photoshop naming. So now I'm going to activate my clone stamp tool. Take a look at it and go, all right, first thing I want to do, I'm going to do the top. Then I'm going to come down and do the bottom to make sure I do them the same way. So at the top, I want to kind of see if I can continue this edge and then fill in the rest of the brick. So for this, I might bump it down a little bit more. Let's clone here right on the edge. See if I can't connect them together. Nope, don't like that. Let's Z back. Let's try that. Yeah, it's still the same. Try to zoom in a little bit more. Let's try that. All right, that's not too bad. All right, now for this little piece here, believe it or not, I'm going to sample a couple of times and I'm going to make my brush a little smaller. So I want to try and get a little more precision. Let's do that. And take a little darker area just to kind of make it look a little imperfect. So now I want to kind of do the same thing to the bottom. Continue on. This one, not quite so much in the color variation. So let's sample that top. There we go. All right, so I would want to continue going up here. Any imperfections that I see. For the color variations, let me kind of zoom in on this area. Right here, color variations, I don't want to cover them up. I want to blend them together. So that's where I would use the healing brush. So healing brush, same parameters. I don't want current layer. I want current and below. Always check your settings. Yep, current and below, which is good. Come on, go away. So you have your own brush size. Want to make sure your brush hardness is at 100%. I'm good with that. So now, let me sample this area, and let's see what I get when I clone. All right, so it did a decent job kind of blending in a little bit there. I'm going to get rid of that. Let me sample over here. Let's do that. So that's a lot less noticeable than what was there. And that's really the name of the game. So here, I can see a line. Let's grab this. So anything that has some really noticeable lines, I just want to get rid of. So up here, I think I'd rather replace that small chunk with a clone stamp. So again, just trying to do a little damage control there so it looks a little better. Now, I got some grout areas here. So this is a good time for me to use my clone stamp. And let's sample the grout from up there and see if we can't get it to kind of cover up some of those imperfections here. Not really crazy about that either. There we go. So that's a little better. For some reason, when I try to sample, has an X in the crosshairs. Make sure, Miles, you're on the correct layer. Make sure your layer is not visible also. Make sure you're on the clone layer and make sure you didn't accidentally turn visibility off. All right. So, I mean, I would probably spend a little more time doing that, but you get the idea. All right, so now that we've done that, what I want to do is take these two layers. I'm on clone and it's still visible. Can you unmute yourself there?
Yes. So, I'm following you step by step, and once I select, like when I select the stamp tool, for cloning the clone stamp, um, when I go to like sample part of the brick wall, and I hit option, if I look closely, it has like the crosshairs, but then in the middle there's like a small red X through it that won't let me sample.
And you're positive it won't let you sample, like you try to sample and stamp and you get nothing?
Yeah.
Does it give you an error when you try to stamp?
No, it just won't let me, like if I'm holding down option and I like click to sample, nothing happens. And then if I try to go somewhere to like put that cloning stamp, nothing else happens.
All right, let me stop sharing and you can share your screen.
Okay.
Let's see what you're getting here.
Okay. So sorry, let me bring this over.
All right, so you got the clone on.
Yeah. So because I already did the offset and everything, and there's all this.
Did you check your sample at the top in the tool options?
Up here?
Yes. No, keep going to the right. No, keep going. It says sample. You have current layer selected. It's got to be current and below.
Oh, okay.
Because right now you're on a blank layer, you have nothing to clone. So what you want to have is, if you don't have current and below on, it won't let you sample your background layer, which is below the layer you currently have selected.
Okay.
So now do it.
Okay, there we go.
Okay.
All right. Thank you.
Yep. All right, let's go back, share mine. Let's pull this over. Actually, I'm glad you came up with that, because that is a really good example of what happens with the default tools. Like that will still happen with the healing brush, which is what I got when I first did it. And I realized, oh, right, I got to make sure it is set for current and below. All right, so now we've got this done. What I'm going to do is select both layers. Shift select. I'm going to right click and I want to duplicate those layers. Why? Because I want copies of them to merge together to become my high pass filter. So once I duplicate those layers, Photoshop will automatically select the new copied layers, rename them. So now I can just right click and merge those selected copied layers. So this is going to be my high pass filter. So high pass filter. Now with a single layer, I can go and use another filter in Photoshop. So with that merged layer together, that single layer, I can go to filter, other, high pass. Now, just like with offset, I got 3 dots. That's going to give me some user input. So it goes anywhere from 0.1 pixels to 1,000 pixels. All it's doing is selecting the range of the pixels you want to apply the high pass to. My image is not even 1,000 pixels. It's 786. But generally, somebody's got their mic on. That might be you, Miles. There we go. Okay, so with this, we only want to do between like 1 and 2 pixels that's the range we want to be able to have for the high pass filter to work. It's going to work on the entire image, but we don't want to select the entire image as like one range. We want little tiny ranges so we get a reasonable result trying to sharpen it. It's like kind of a threshold. So usually anywhere between 1 and 2. I usually like to start at 1.5. The nice thing about having that is that it allows me, if I don't like the result, I can adjust the opacity of that layer. And right now you're thinking, okay, great. Yeah, you applied the high pass filter, but you know, it looks like garbage. Well, that's because we need to apply basically our blend mode in Photoshop that allows the layers below it to show through. Now, the nice thing about Photoshop is the newer versions, if you select one of the blend modes, it'll do it as a preview in your image. So I can see exactly what each one of these is doing. Overlay. I mean, there's a whole bunch of things here. Soft light, hard light. So actually overlay is what we want. Although, you know, some of the other effects are pretty nice too. They do look like they're kind of amplifying that hard light is kind of amplifying that high pass effect. But I'm just going to choose overlay because that's going to give me closest to what the original image is with a few sharpened pixels. So let me zoom in a little. Maybe you might be able to see it on the screen. I'm not sure that you'll be able to see it too much in Zoom because Zoom, the video is compressed and, you know, I'm streaming it. But this is what it looks like before I did the high pass. Now I'm zoomed in extreme, but this is what it looks like with it. So you can see it's ever so slightly sharper. So no high pass filter, high pass filter. Now I could undo this, go back, maybe crank it up to 2 if I want more of an exaggerated effect. But the idea is you don't want to sharpen it to the point where somebody goes, wow, you sharpened that image. That kind of negates the effect. You want to make it so that it looks a little bit better. That's not noticeable hitting people across the face. So for me, that's good enough. Like I said, if I want to adjust my opacity, I can kind of dial down the effect if I want to. You know, and I could also go back and I could try one of the harder effects like hard light, but I'm going to keep it. So that gives me a slightly sharper looking image just to kind of compensate for the file compression. All right, so this is basically my base color map. So I'm going to go File, Save As. Format we want to save it out as is a Targa. Why a Targa? It gives us the ability to have a 32-bit image if we need it. It's mostly lossless, not completely, and doesn't take up as much memory as an EXR. EXRs would be kind of overkill for this project. And also, if you pass this off to your client or you want to throw it into a game engine, it may or may not be able to handle EXRs. So you got to make sure that your file format for your target is correct. So I'm going to save it as Targa down here at the bottom. And I like to name it at the very end of the string, right before the file extension, base color. Oops. There we go. So 24-bit, why? Because we don't need an alpha channel, which is what the extra 8 bits would be. So 24-bit is RGB, perfect. Click OK. Now we've got our base color map. From this is our springboard to make a bump map. So now this is where we decide. All right, for a bump map, do I need color information? Answer, nope. So, as you're making maps, you can kind of write down a list for yourself. Do I need color information? No. All right, so what I can do is use an adjustment layer, which down at the bottom of the layers, if you go to the left of where you added a new layer, go to, there's a half dark, half light circle, and we want to go down to black and white. What that will do is make a new layer, throw it at the top of the chain, and convert everything to black and white automatically. Now, the beauty is I didn't damage my original file. I can just turn that off and I'm back to color. So now we have to decide, is this giving me the right bump orientation? So we already talked about this. No, the answer is no. So we need to invert or flip-flop it. Now, I could go up to image and invert up there, but that would permanently flip my base image. I don't want that. I want another adjustment layer. So I click down in the adjustment layer, scroll to the bottom, and there's my invert. So now all the darks are now light, all the lights are now dark. And the only thing left for me personally is I want to get a little more contrast between the grout and the brick. I want the bricks to be a little lighter, want the grout to be a little darker. I like all those imperfections, the scratches, what will eventually become little raised areas, little lowered areas in there. So for me, that's going to be utilizing another adjustment layer. And here we got contrast and brightness, levels, curves, exposure. Like I said, I like levels because with levels, I've got control over, pull this down a little bit. I've got control over my highs, my midtones, and my lows. So you can see here in my slope, my little histogram, I've got basically no brights, no whites. I don't have pure whites in this. Oh, it doesn't even get light until right about here, but I really don't see any variation till right where it starts to slope up. So what I'm going to do is compress. I'm going to take those wide range areas. I don't need all that. What I want to do is bring that over here. I want to do the same thing with my darks. I really don't have much in the way of darks until right about here. So I can kind of push that over. So right now, I've gotten a little more contrast out of it just by pushing down the highs and pushing up the lows. Now, the midtones, I can drag. If I drag it to the right towards the lights, it's going to increase the dark range. I got more dark in here. If I go to the left, it's going to increase the right. What I want to do is kind of compress this even more. So right here, this is where all my information is. So I'm going to take my brights, them down. Let's take the darks. I'm going to put it right here where it slopes up the highest. And now I can adjust my midtones to be either lighter or darker. Make them a little bit lighter, just so it kind of pops out. So now it doesn't look as flat. Looks like it has a little more contrast, a little more highs, a little more lows. And that's kind of what I want to be able to see in my bump map. So I like that. I'm going to save that, utilize that as my bump map. We've made it black and white. We've inverted it, thrown on some levels to kind of adjust, the highs, the lows, push the midtones so they look good. So now save as, again, same file format, Targa. And this is going to be called my bump. I can name it height. I can name it whatever I want, as long as my rule of thumb for naming files is if somebody were to give this to me, what would I want it called? How would I know where to put it? Base color tells me where to put it. Spec tells me where to put it. Roughness and bump tells me where it goes. So I'm going to save 24-bit. Yep, the scratches should be darker because they do cut into the bricks. What you could do is, if you had the time, is you would have to go into each individual brick and invert that by itself. Because remember, we inverted everything, so the grout was lighter. Personally, I can justify this by going out to any brick wall and looking. There are raised areas, there's indentations. Is somebody actually going to notice it? Maybe, but the chances are no, not really. It's going to look like a brick wall. So yeah, I cheat, but you know, if you wanted to, you could go back in and do that. Like I said, you could do that to one or two of the bricks so it looks a little, you know, random, the way it goes in and out. Then you run into, do I have to put a layer adjustment on just that little brick? Because now I've inverted it and now I've kind of flip-flopped the lights and darks. Does it match with the rest of the bricks? All right, so we've got our base color. We've got our bump map. Let's go see what they look like. So I'm going to quit out of Photoshop. Why? Because I'm going to be going into Maya, and Maya and Photoshop do not play well together. All right, here are my files that we just made. There's my base color, and here is my bump to go with that. Now, these files need to go into your source images folder for your project. Don't put them somewhere else. Don't put them on the desktop. Don't put them in another folder, because if you move it anywhere, it's going to break the connection and you're going to have to go looking for them. So put everything in your source images. In fact, I like to put the PSD in there. So if I have to work on it, I know exactly where it is. So what I'm going to do is copy these guys. And let's go drop them into the Zen garden. And I got a separate Zen garden source images that I've been collecting. And here's my Lecture 8 stuff. So let's delete everything but the source. We're going to put brand new textures in. So I'm going to paste in my Photoshop, my base color, and my bump. So they're all set to go. So let's fire up Maya. I'm going to load it into the scene that we just got done doing. We're playing around with the color map, the spec map, the roughness, and the bump. Because I did apply that brick to the ground plane. So we'll be able to play around with that. No, come on. Okay. Set project. Why? Because don't trust Maya. Okay, lecture 8. There we go. All right, so this is my material that I added. we can see that's what we're going to get when we use the raw, unprocessed source image. All right, so a couple of things you can see here right away is that it's really bright. So let me drop my base weight down a little bit. There we go. It's a little better. All right, so I'm going to keep that image. Why? Because I want to compare it to what we just made in Photoshop. Now I'm going to do this a little bit differently because normally I don't like to put on my, if I've got a color map and a bump map, I usually don't like to put the color on first because I'm distracted by the color. I want to see what the bump is doing. So I'm going to put the bump map first, put it on first, and then we'll add in the diffuse. So first thing I'm going to do, assign a new material. So this is going to be called brick seamless. So like I said, I'm not going to plug in my diffuse first. I'm going to go down to geometry, and I'm going to plug my bump in. 2D file. There's my file node. Let's go get the Zen garden. And here is my bump. So now I can sort of see it in my viewport, but don't rely on that being accurate. All right, so first thing first, I got to turn down that base weight a little bit better, really bright. But I can see right away that scale is nowhere near what I want it to be. So how do we adjust the scale? How do we get it to copy itself and repeat itself? That's going to be the place 2D that's attached to the file node. So I'm going to open up the Hypershade. There's my brick seamless. Let's graph it. This little node right here, that's how I get it to repeat. So let's make it repeat a couple of times. It's getting better. Not quite. Let's try 6. Still a little big. Let's try 8. That's pretty close. Now, with any bump map, I want to lower the amount of bump. And that's going to be my bump utility, bump depth. So I'm going to start at 0.1. Now, if I think my bricks are a little stretched still, even though we made the texture square, well, the geometry I put it on is probably not square because that's a big rectangle for the asphalt. I can actually make it repeat in a non-uniform fashion. So what I can do is, well, let's kind of squash it together. So if I make it repeat what, maybe 10 times in U, it looks about the right scale. Looks a little more uniform. Oh, 19? Wait, no. Maybe it is a 2-to-1 squash. All right, so there's my bump. Now I want to add in my diffuse, my base color. So let's select that. Base color is going to go up here. And base color, there we go. All right, so by default, it's not going to line up with my bump because they have two separate little nodal networks, right? Two separate files, two separate place 2Ds. The idea is, wouldn't it be better if I could just have one place 2D drive my bump and drive my base color? Because then I'd only have to change it in one spot and it would automatically scale correctly. Well, the answer is yes, you can do that, but it requires a middle mouse and modifier key to be able to do it. And you can only do it in the hypershade. So what I want to do is I want to have this place 2D that we already set up with the bump. I want to have it also drive my file node, my base color. So it looks like, oh, just a simple connection over here. But there's actually a ton of stuff going on under there. It's all of the, well, it's all this stuff that's in there. It looks like a single connection, but it's actually kind of like fiber optics. There's like a million tiny little connections in there. So what we do is, if you hold the command key down, on a PC, it's going to be control, command, and this little level of detail icon right here, kind of looks like the Burger King icon. Hold command, middle mouse click, and drag and drop it on top of the little icon of the brick. It will automatically disconnect this and reconnect both together. So let me do that again, one more time. All right, so I've already got the amount of repeats set up. I want this to drive this also. Hold command, middle mouse click and drag right in this area. Drop it on top of this little picture. It looks like a little picture of the brick. Release the mouse, release the command. And now this can be deleted. And when I look in my screen, now everything lines up. So now I can say, oh, all right, well, maybe that's a little too small. Let me resize that. So now I've got one area here. So let's try making this like 6. Yeah, that's not bad. Now let's compare and see exactly what that bump is doing for us. So what I'm going to do, rather than disconnect it or do anything silly, I'm just going to zero out my bump. If you turn your bump to 0, that is like turning it off. So you can see with it off, it looks really flat compared to that. That bump, even though it's an illusion, adds just that little bit of relief to give you the illusion that, hey, there's little highs and little lows, and we're getting a little bit of shadow in there. Now, if that's still too much bump, don't be afraid, drop it down even more. A lot of times, less with a bump map is actually more. It looks better. All right, so that is 0.1, that's 0.05. And, oh, I forgot to turn off my denoise. It's still denoising in there. That's hilarious. Right, does that kind of make sense? The workflow? Now, the nice thing about Substance is, as you guys are painting in Substance, you're generating all the maps at once. But a lot of times, you may not be able to use Substance. I mean, it's rare, but it might happen. Or you need to do something, make it seamless, and then just make a couple of maps really quick. Might be quicker to just keep doing it in Photoshop rather than make the seamless texture in Photoshop, then take it into Substance, then play with it, and then bring out your maps. Especially if you need just color and a bump, or color and a spec map or something. Question? Your base color is not showing. All right, let me stop my screen here. And do you have Wi-Fi? Do you have Zoom running? Ah, there we go. Okay. So what I want you to do is, why don't you share your screen with me? I'm going to stop sharing and share your screen. And let's see what we have. All right, so show me your material. All right, so I'm looking down at your material here, and it looks like you've got it plugged into the specular color rather than the base color. So what I want you to do is, in the hypershade, pan over so we can see your connections on your material. All right, so zoom in there. What we want to do is we want to disconnect it from here and connect it to the base color. Try clicking like right to the left of it. Click, hold, drag. There you go. Now try that. Looks like it worked. Good. So yeah, just be careful, because that's the thing that kind of irritates me about Arnold, is that a lot of times the base will be hidden for some reason. I don't know why, but it doesn't always return to the top of the material if you're working and you close it and you open it again. So I think that might have been what happened to yours. Yep, good. Will we have a written copy of the Photoshop and plugin steps? The Photoshop steps are in the PowerPoint. Plugin steps. What do you mean? Oh, up here? No, because actually you guys are going to get really good at where to plug stuff in over the next 3 classes. Because every class we're going to be, okay, this is a map. We're going to put the map in here. We're going to see what happens. So don't worry if it's a little daunting. The thing you just need to know really is, you plug your color into the base color, You plug your spec into the specular weight, roughness goes into roughness, bump goes down under geometry there. If you make a mistake, right click on the actual attribute, break the connection, put a new one in. If you're scared by the hypershade, do that. If you're not, go into the hypershade, play around. And if you make a mistake, just don't save your scene and reopen it again. Actually, what I would suggest is if you're new to the hypershade, just go in and make a new blank scene. Just make a material. Don't even have to assign it to anything, and practice plugging stuff into it and unplugging it. That'll get you over sticker shock. All right, good question. Any other questions? Everybody good? How about in the Zoomosphere? Questions? So a lot of information, I know. Fortunately, it looks like our recording is working okay here. So hopefully we'll be able to get that out for you guys. All right, so Patrick, Miles, Jesus, Diamond, Craig, Christopher, anybody have any questions? All good? Everybody good in here too? Good, okay, thank you. All right. Good job, guys. Hang in there with me. Appreciate it. So let's go to lunch and come back to lab at, well, let's make it 1:50 because by the time we get out of here, it'll be 50. So come back to lab at 1:50.